journalist, and I will be your moderator. We're very privileged to have with us two distinguished guests. History, as we've heard in the last couple of months in Japan, is always a very live issue in this country. It keeps coming up again and again. Our two guests today are dealing with history and with an alternative view of history. Oliver Stone, of course, is a movie director. He's one of the most consistently provocative and interesting movie directors to come out of America in the last quarter century. He made his mark with a series of cultural landmarks that have provoked admiration and, I think you won't disagree, controversy over the last 25 years, sometimes in equal measures. His first major feature is Salvador, which a lot of people haven't seen, which is a wonderful movie. And Platoon were very angry indictments of American foreign policy. In Wall Street, he got the zeitgeist of Reaganite America, perhaps better than any other director working at the time. In 1994, his film Natural Born Killers triggered debate on movie violence and so on. His longtime collaborator is Peter Kuznick. He's director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University in Washington, D.C. He's a professor of history. The Institute aims to educate students as well as the general public about the key points of nuclear history and nuclear culture in the United States, and of course on the legitimacy of using the nuclear weapon, nuclear bomb, not only using it but deploying it, most famously of course in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Peter is a scholar of the roots of American empire and the growth of the secret state, and he seeks to debunk the myth of American exceptionalism. They're in Japan to promote a book and of course a documentary series. Oliver Stone's 10-part Untold History of the US has been described as riveting, provocative, and a revelation. And again, I don't think you'll disagree if conservatives have described it as mendacious Cold War revisionism and mindless Stalinist propaganda. That's one of my favorite phrases, mindless Stalinist propaganda. I can barely get it out in one word. It's been run on the US cable and satellite network Showtime since last year. It's been repeated and it's about to be screened in Japan. So I think they're both going to talk for 10 minutes each. There's the book, by the way, right here in Japanese. They're going to talk. Oliver's going to talk first, Peter's second. And kind of remind you that we're sort of making mini history today because this is the first time we're live streaming on the FCCJ website. So it's available if you go to the FCCJ website and click on the link, you can see it. I should also introduce my colleague over there, Lucy Birmingham, president of the club. Oliver, whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Thank you for having us. We're glad to be here and honored by your presence. To make an overview, and we'll turn this over for questions and we'll get more specific, but to give you a brief overview of how this thing got started and how I got started, because I tie into this. I was born in '46, a year after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I grew up conservative. My father was a Republican stockbroker. He was on the staff of Eisenhower's in World War II. And I grew up in New York City, and I saw the world through New York City eyes. Post-war, it was the place to be. I went to schools, good schools, and I served in Vietnam in 1967-8. I came through Tokyo in '65 as a teacher in Vietnam. I consulted all the old Tokyo hands on Asia. Everyone was very deeply worried about the communist threat. Not only in Vietnam, but coming towards Tokyo. Tokyo was the capital of the domino principle. That was where, if Vietnam fell, Thailand, and so forth and so on, Philippines, it would come here to Tokyo. Japan was the objective to hold on to. I say that just in passing because I'll come back to bear later. I fought in the war, and I didn't really, although it was, I've documented it, at the time I was really more like a survivor, numbed out, alienated, came back to my country, found my way back into society. It took some time. But essentially I went to film school. I was very lucky. I got to film school at the right time, and I learn how to make films and struggled through the 70s. And as the 70s was going on, my evolution occurred there in the sense of people talking to me, telling me things, experience, reading. There was, of course, the Watergate scandal and then the famous church committee hearings in 1975, which really affected me deeply because, you know, it was about our government lying to its citizens on a constant basis. It was very upsetting, and I think, although it's the tip of the iceberg now, we realize at that time it was quite something. And that's why every little bit counts, every little inch counts when you can uncover a story, even if it doesn't seem like so at the time. But it really affected me. And I remember the FISA court in 1977, they passed that legislation, and that was supposed to be a corrective to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. That was supposed to be a way of reforming the system of intervention, CIA, dirty secrets, intervening in foreign countries, and so on. By the 1980s, I wasn't totally convinced that the United States was up to no good. I actually went to Central America with Richard Boyle, and from there I saw that this was getting, in my own hands, my own eyes, I saw Nicaragua, I saw Guatemala, and I saw Salvador, and Honduras too. And I saw U.S. troops in many of these places starting to come in, and I saw the influence, the CIA, and I realized that this was Vietnam redux. This was going to happen again. Reagan, had he not been derailed, was planning a war in Nicaragua. He was going to stop the commies from getting across the Rio Grande. So this was when I made the film Salvador, which David kindly mentioned in 1985-6, I was on a path that was a new path for me. It was to try to make progressive films that made a difference, trying to point the finger at things that no other U.S. Filmmakers were really pointing at. It was coming from Europe, the criticism on Vietnam, but it wasn't really severe. Yes, it was in the U.S., but it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough. And I made Salvador. It failed at the box office, but it succeeded, and I had some luck, and I was able to make Platoon, which had enormous success. And then from Platoon on, I continued to try to make progressive films. But, and I made quite a few. It had a lot of controversy, as David has said. It taught me a lot about the way the U.S. sees itself, the media sees the U.S. By 2008, I was almost 62 years old, 61 years old. I decided after 8 years of George Bush that I could not go on just making an feature film. I said, this is insane. This is an insane situation. I knew Peter since 1995. He'd been a teacher at American University. He had me there. He was teaching a class in my films, actually. And it was we had a relationship that went on for 12 years. But by 2008, I went to him. I said, let's try and do something about this. Let's do a documentary about at least the atomic bomb and how this thing came about and what it meant to the United States foreign life. I mean, to the United States in general. It grew quickly from a 1.5-hour documentary to a 12-hour documentary that we did over the next 5 years. We didn't know it then, but we were in for it. It was the most difficult, perhaps, film of my life to make, and it took the most amount of time and energy. We released it in 2012 on Showtime, almost 5 years after we started it. And in it, of course, the first 3 chapters are devoted to World War II and the atomic bomb here in Japan. And in that atomic bombing, we find everything that's wrong with the United States today. We find the lying, the official denial, the censorship, obviously, I think many of you know, but some of you probably may not agree with us, but the predominant myth was the United States had to drop those bombs to win World War II. That the Japanese would have resisted, they were fanatics, and that it would be Okinawas and Iwo Jimas until the very end. And the bomb saved, according to various estimates, hundreds of thousands of American lives. Now this is all lies, and we go into some depth to reveal this in the series and in the book in more depth. I urge you, if you haven't read it, to please read it. What is relevant to us is that Japan was seeking to surrender very actively. It was using the Soviets to try to, diplomatically, to try to reach out to us. And they were most astounded when the Soviets invaded on August 9th, when they invaded Japan, and they cut off forever the diplomatic lifeline that Japan had. It was the Soviet invasion. We have talked to many of the Japanese survivors of those blasts, the Hibakusha, and they have told us that they didn't know anything what the A-bomb was. They'd been bombed all that spring, all that year. They were exhausted, famished. The economy was breaking down. What they did know was that the Soviets would, the news was the Soviets invaded. That made the news. The atomic bomb was just another bomb. After the firebombing of Tokyo, it doesn't even compare to some of it. Anyway, the Soviet invasion was very important, and when we look at American history books, it is mentioned briefly in a compartmentalized way that doesn't make sense. So, you have to understand the Potsdam position, you have to understand what Truman was thinking, what he knew about the Soviet invasion. He wanted the Soviet invasion when he went to Potsdam. He was all for it. Roosevelt certainly wanted it. It would end the war without American involvement. And it would have ended the war because, frankly, the Soviets wiped out the Kwangtung army. They demolished the 1 million man Kwangtung army in a matter of days in Manchuria. In a matter of days. This was the strongest army Japan had left. It would have been conceivably very little time for the Soviets to reach into Japan itself and take Hokkaido, and this was a big concern of the Japanese War Cabinet. They were terrified and stunned by this invasion, and within a few days, of course, the emperor surrendered, and Soviet Union was effectively cut out of the Japan as a post-war basis for Soviets to operate, and this is what the United States wanted. The Soviets were cut out of decision-making in the Far East. The United States took control of Japan completely, censored the atomic bombs, and the rest it becomes dirtier and dirtier as the United States uses Japan to fight communism in the Far East, which is what I alluded to on Vietnam. And here we are in Japan now in 2013. It seems like we live too long sometimes. And the story goes on and on and on. And as I've said to the Japanese media, into their face, it seems you people don't, like you are like the United States people, you don't know your own history. It's untold. It's unlearned. You went through World War II, and unlike the German people, who at least they were re-educated forcibly in Germany. The Germans had an understanding of what happened with Hitler. I don't find that to be true here, except among the more educated Japanese or more liberal Japanese. There's just no knowledge of it. It's astounding to me. But when I go back to the United States, how can we hold our hand and say, consider ourselves superior, when my own daughter, at 17 years old in a good school in Los Angeles, doesn't really understand what happened in World War II. The myth is the United States. The myth is we ended World War II with the atomic bomb. The truth is we trashed the memory of all the sacrifice that went into World War II from both the Soviet and U.S. sides by resorting to the bomb to end it. It ends it on a dirty note. It sends the wrong message to the world. It sends terror to the world. Whereas truly it was a great victory for many men who died and women. And this is a sense I find from history, a sense of injustice and anger about this, and it motivates me surprisingly at the age of 66 today, that I'm still angry about the way we tell our history to our kids, in both countries. And on that note, my 12 minutes are up, 13 minutes. Thank you for listening to me. I'll turn it over to Peter.
Oliver and I share a passionate concern about the importance of history. We agree with Orwell and others who said that he who controls the past controls the present, he who controls the present controls the future. We think that understanding of the past is actually worth fighting for. Every person has his or her own interpretation of history. Some people is conscious, most people is not very conscious, but they act in the world based on an understanding of history. Unfortunately, that understanding is often confused or flat out wrong. in the United States in 2011 was issued what was called America's Report Card. Based on that, the American high school seniors were weakest in U.S. history. We sometimes bemoan the fact that our students are so weak in math and science. According to the National Report Card, they're weaker in U.S. history. Of those surveyed, 12% were viewed to be proficient in U.S. history. 12% proficient, not outstanding, but proficient, barely competent. Of those 12%, only 2% could identify the issue that was addressed by Brown versus Board of Education, even though that was implicit in the way the question was asked. So we're dealing with two problems. One is historical amnesia, or lack of knowledge. And the second is that to the extent that students in the United States and the public knows history, they've got it wrong. And we looked, that's why we began our documentary series with World War II. Because the fundamental myths that guide the post-war period take root in our understanding of World War II. We trace it back earlier in the book and the documentaries we're putting out, but World War II is central to this. The three basic myths that come out of World War II for the United States. One is that the United States won the war in Europe. The reality for anybody who studied that is that the Soviet Union won the war in Europe. Throughout most of that war, the Americans and the British faced 10 German divisions combined, while the Soviets were facing 200 German divisions. Churchill says it was the Soviet army that tore the guts out of the Nazis. Churchill admits that. The Soviets lost 27 million in World War II. The Americans and the British around 300,000. In order to take the pressure off the Soviet Union, Roosevelt promised publicly in mid-1942 to open up a second front in Europe before the end of 1942. Roosevelt wanted to. Marshall wanted to. Eisenhower wanted to. Churchill said no. And so instead, the United States went chasing British imperial interests in Northern Africa, in the Mediterranean, throughout that region, while the Soviets were dying. And the Soviets won that war. That's myth number one. Myth number two that Oliver was just talking about is the atomic bombing. The American students are taught that this was a heroic act, necessary, the good thing to end the war, to save American lives, or else we would have lost 500,000 Truman rights in an invasion. Oliver says there's no truth to that, but Americans mostly don't know that. After the bomb was dropped, 85% of the American public said they thought it was a good thing. 23% said they wished the Japanese had not surrendered so quickly so we could have dropped more atomic bombs on them. There was such a hatred toward the Japanese. And the history gets covered up. The official narratives come out, and they tell the story. The reality, as Oliver was saying, was that the United States had already been firebombing Japanese cities, over 100 Japanese cities. We'd proven to the Japanese leaders that we could wipe out Japanese cities. 99.5% of the city of Toyama. Secretary of War Henry Stimson says to Truman, I don't want the United States to get the reputation of outdoing Hitler in atrocities with our firebombing. So that's not what changed it, the atomic bombs. We were already wiping out cities. What changed it, as Oliver said, was the Soviet invasion, because that undermined the Japanese diplomatic strategy, and it undermined their military strategy, the Ketsugo strategy. So the whole strategy was bankrupt, and the war ends, but the United States spreads these myths about what really was happening. Because we pose the question, how would the world now look at nuclear weapons if it was Germany that dropped the first bombs, not the United States? The world would have recoiled in horror at the brutality and inhumanity of the Nazis for dropping atomic bombs and wiping out cities. And we should recoil in horror. But because it was the United States, the victors in the war, and it tied into the fundamental myth, was the myth of American exceptionalism. This has guided American policy really from the founding aboard the Arbella, when Jonathan Winthrop says in 1630 that we shall be as a city upon the hill, we will be the moral guide to the rest of the universe. But it comes out more clearly after World War II, this idea of American benevolence, the myth of American exceptionalism, that other countries are greedy, self-interested, territorial aggrandizing, pushing for their own power, but the United States is different. The United States is benevolent, altruistic, generous. We just want to spread freedom and democracy. Well, obviously you know that, what a myth that is. And George Kennan, who is the architect of America's Cold War policy, the containment policy, which we're now adjusting toward China, Kennan says in 1948 that the United States has 6.3% of the world population, but we control 50% of the world's wealth. Our goal in the future period has got to be to figure out a way to maintain that disparity. He says we can't get caught up in sentimentalism. We can't talk about freedom and human rights. So that's not what it's about. It's about maintaining America's power and American influence and this disparity in wealth. And the United States goes off on that direction. The third myth, then, is the origins of the Cold War. In the United States, we taught that the United States was simply responding to Soviet aggression, that the Soviets wanted to expand into Europe, that the Soviets wanted ports, that the Soviets wanted territory. What we show in Untold History is that that is not what happened. That Franklin Roosevelt had a vision for the post-war world. That this vice president before Truman, Henry Wallace, had the greatest vision for the post-war world, a world of collaboration, friendship, ending imperialism and colonialism, ending exploitation, the U.S. and the Soviets working together to spread a very different message of peace. Truman gets in there. Truman had said in 1941, he said, if the Germans are winning, we should support the Russians, and if the Russians are winning, we should support the Germans, and that way let them kill as many of each other as possible. He gets in there and he's got that same mindset. And so within 2 weeks, Truman takes office April 12th. By the time that the Americans meet with Molotov on April 23rd, U.S. policy has flipped 180 degrees. Now the Soviets are being viewed as our enemy. Now the Soviets are being accused of breaking their agreements. We later backed off and said, well, actually, they had the right interpretation and we didn't. But the mistrust follows at that point. And then the atomic bomb feeds into that. Because the Soviets knew better than anybody how devastated the Japanese were. Because Japan was trying to get the Soviets to negotiate to get Japan better surrender terms. So how did the Soviets interpret the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? They said this bomb is being dropped on us, and we are the real targets because Japan is already defeated. And they were right. And Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project, says, I had no illusions. From the time I took over this project, I knew that Russia was really our enemy and the project was directed in that way. And so we focus on this because what we're trying to show is the pattern. And the pattern continues. We see not a straight line, fortunately, it's a curved line because there are attempts to change that. There are opportunities to change that. 1953, March 5th, Stalin dies. Soviet leaders head out an olive branch to the United States, asking basically to end the Cold War. What does the United States do? We repudiate that. We vastly increase our nuclear arsenal and our expansion and bases and strength around the world. 1962, we had another opportunity after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy learned the lesson. Kennedy and Khrushchev both said, we can work together to change the world. Let's end the Cold War. They both wanted to. Said, let's get rid of every possible conflict that can lead to another confrontation like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And they were doing that. And Kennedy gets assassinated. Oliver wrote a brilliant movie, made a brilliant movie about the Kennedy assassination, which raises a lot of the issues that we're getting at. So Wallace was destroyed in 1945-46, Kennedy in 1962, but there's going to be time after time with Carter's election, there's going to be with the end of the Cold War, instead of the United States reaching out to Russia in 1991, we praised Russia for not, Gorbachev, for not going into Eastern Europe with troops. What do? We invade Panama, we invade Kuwait, we spread the empire, we undermine the Soviet economy. The American advisors go in there, and within a few years, the Soviet standard of living has dropped 90% based on America's shock therapy that we offered the Soviet economy. We had hope again with the election of Obama. Our hopes, of course, were very, very, very badly disappointed. As we can see now, we can talk about the question and answer. Now Obama's Asia pivot is the same kind of unfortunate, misguided policy. So what we're trying to show are the patterns that exist from the 1890s through the World War II, post-war period, right up to the present. And if you take the broad view as we're trying to do, and you see those patterns, you understand why Obama has gone along, in part, with so much of the Bush administration policies. As Ari Fleischer, Bush's press secretary, said recently, this is the fourth term of the Bush administration. What we see now is not Obama challenging empire, Obama running it more efficiently. Obama putting into place, institutionalizing the policies that George Bush and Cheney introduced, but were considered to be so outrageous. Now under Obama, they're given a human face and an intelligent explanation on occasion, and they're being institutionalized. In some ways, this is more dangerous than the cowboy crazy policies of the Bush administration. So thanks for coming, and we're happy to talk and answer your questions.
Thank you for those speeches. Okay, we're going to take questions from the working press first, which is these three tables here, and then we'll open it up to the rest of the audience. Can I remind you, when you come to the microphone, can you give your name and the name of your organization, and can you avoid speechifying if possible? Aldrich just said he's completely wrecked after 12 days of this, so no questions about Michael Jackson's, Michael Douglas's sex life, for example. I see Khaldun's hand first.
Did Michael Jackson have a sex life?
Please talk about it later. I'll tell you direct news. My question is about Japan. So now America was leading lies about nuclear weapons. So what Japan should do now, because they use American nuclear umbrella to protect themselves. Do you think the Tokyo Turbine or the Tokyo Court after the World War II should be reviewed, and it should be a new system from now on?
Sorry, Calvin, you want to know where you're from?
Syria, originally.
Syria.
Yes.
Wow.
Thank you.
We're glad to say that a Syrian publisher has just contracted to put out an Arabic version of the Untold history. So we're looking forward to that. The U.S.-Japan relationship is problematic. This goes way back to the post-World War II period when the United States occupied Japan and censored the Japanese press. This is why the kind of effort that we see here today is so important. And we saw what happened during censorship. During that period, the Japanese were not allowed to even talk or write or have symposiums on the atomic bomb. It was a period of very, very harsh censorship that lasted until 1952. But the Americans have treated Japan largely as our errand boys ever since, as our junior partners in spreading the empire. And so the United States in 1960, with the re-upping of AMPO under Kishi, that family is very important to Japan's not telling the history about its own, the truth about its own history. Because you had Kishi in 1960, then you had Sato, his brother, in 1972, with the reversion of Okinawa. Okinawa reverts back to Japan. He announces the 3 non-nuclear principles, but he cuts a secret deal with the United States to allow the introduction of nuclear weapons into Okinawa. And then you follow that straight through to Abe, to Kishi's grandson. And Abe is one of the worst deniers of real history. It's the kind of thing that we're fighting against. We're fighting against people because it's a universal pattern. And it's not just the victors, sometimes it's the victims, the losers, who also deny their history. Much of Asia now doesn't want to tell the real history about Japanese occupation because they want Japanese tourists. But Abe, it's one of the things we've seen. On the one hand, the issues that get discussed are the comfort women and the Nanjing massacre. There's some discussion of that. There's very little discussion of what else happened during the Japanese occupation and Japanese empire, when the Japanese go into Burma and Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore and Vietnam, and what they do throughout that region. With the comfort women, we see the comfort women issue being talked about in terms of Korean. That was happening all over Asia under the Japanese occupation. A much worse story, a much uglier story than is taught in Japan or elsewhere. So we think that it's essential to hold the mirror up and put a spotlight on every country's untold history, the things that allow the kinds of policies you're talking about to continue. The nuclear umbrella. Japan should be leading the fight to get rid of nuclear weapons. Japan is the only country to have been attacked with nuclear bombs in warfare. Japan has Article 9 in its constitution. That should be a model for the entire world. Instead, Japan undermines the meaning of Article 9 already. Japan has the 4th biggest defense budget in the world. And Japan cowers like a scared child under America's nuclear umbrella. The Japanese should be standing up for independence, for truth, and for resolving these conflicts in a peaceful way, rather than the threat of America's nuclear arms backing you up. It's like some kid who goes out there and picks fights, and then he's got his big brother behind him to go clean up after him. And that doesn't make sense. We want to see a different, we want to see Japan play a leading role in making this a more peaceful world and resolving the conflicts in the Pacific, which some are real conflicts, in a way that shows the vision of Japan, the fact that Japan has a peace constitution and a commitment to non-nuclear resolution rather than the nuclear umbrella.
You want to say something? No? Next question. Go ahead. Stay here. Does anybody have their hand on the back? Because I can't see with his legs. Here.
I'm Nancy Snow. I'm with the Huffington Post. I've also written for 20 years about American propaganda. I haven't yet had the pleasure of reading your series, but do you all address this in the context of propaganda? And Edward R. Murrow said 50 years ago when he headed USIA, truth is the best propaganda. And I think that's what you're getting at here. But how do you awaken people to wanting to go back and learn this history that's so crucial?
Well, from my point of view, I come at this as a dramatist, and he comes at it as a historian. We cross-fertilized all of these 5 years. I mean, the best way is to tell an exciting story. And I think that's what we've done. I think this documentary is the fastest documentary with the most amount of information I've seen. There's no talking heads, there's no stopping, there's no reaffirming. I think it's great filmmaking. That's, of course, me talking about, because I've taken all the techniques from JFK and I've used it in this film. We also use movie clips and I think wonderful music, but it's essentially a movie-going experience that can be watched in the theater. And we've shown it in theaters. I'm going to San Sebastian next month, the Spanish festival, to show all 12 hours. We have 12 hours coming out on DVD. Which is very important for us on the whole series, because no one saw the World War I section as well as the 1930s section, which explains a lot of the background of World War II. That's coming out on October 22 from Warner Brothers. And we also have a paperback as well as a mid-levels, more for younger readers is going to be made, as well as a comic is in the works, like Howard Zinn had a comic. So we're trying to get this out there. We're selling in foreign countries, we've sold Japan, but in Korea we haven't sold. So there's this constant, it's an uphill battle. The mainstream press in the United States was not very kind to us, they ignored us. But we did get great progressive press was really very supportive. So, but mainstream press, the Time magazines, the New York Times, forget about it. It's really sad, and you're right about the ghost of Edward R. Murrow. We need Edward R. Murrow. Where is he now? I mean, he's in our documentary. He's interviewing Truman, by the way, and he gets some of the best stuff ever from Truman. You see Truman's attitude about, when Truman says to Murrow, I never lost a night's sleep over it. It's just heartbreaking that Truman is incapable of any empathy for the victims, or empathy for anybody for that matter, except for his cronies. Excitement, danger, tell it true. People are a sucker for the truth. So if the problem with U.S. history, in my opinion, is that it's sanitized. It's like a Disney movie. So I don't think the kids are responding. And he quoted the poll figures are very low. I don't think kids they know it. They know that U.S. history is crooked. They know that the United States always comes out ahead. And generally it's rigged that way, and it looks good. And there's none of that questioning about the moral imagination of the United States, what was lacking in Truman. My daughter, her school book, it's very compartmentalized. You will have criticism of the Vietnam War. Yes, they're much better on the Vietnam War than they used to be. And it goes into the Vietnam War, but it doesn't go to the Korean War in depth, and it doesn't go into Reagan. It doesn't go into Bush and father going into Kuwait, which is a very important story because that's the end of the Cold War. And we go, instead of committing to peace, we go into Kuwait. That's a very important, and that's overlooked in our history. And it doesn't go into Reagan. Now, Reagan, of course, is a divisive issue, even in the United States, but we do find in the school books that Reagan is given too much benefit of the doubt, and we don't raise enough questions about what he was doing in Afghanistan and how much Reagan has to do with the birth of Al-Qaeda and all this extremism, fundamentalism, how crazy Bill Casey was, how crazy Reagan's view of the world is. We don't get that in American history. We're putting up statues to him in Washington, right? There's a Ronald Reagan Airport right now. That's pretty sad, as well as the Dulles building. So I think Alan Dulles, is it Alan Dulles? And John Foster. These people are getting by. They're being exonerated by our American history.
I'll add a couple of things. You talked about propaganda. You said you've been fighting against propaganda for 20 years. Great, keep up that fight. That's what we need. Especially journalists. Journalists are on the front line there. I.F. Stone, the great independent journalist, used to go around to bodies of journalism schools, and he'd tell the students, if you want to be a journalist, there are 2 words you have to remember: government's lie. And one time he added, and the Americans are the only ones who smoke the same hashish they pass out. So very often American journalists believe their own propaganda, and they're key. You know, plus television, plus the schools, plus the textbooks, as Oliver says. Oliver said that the treatment of Vietnam is improving. I hope that's true, but we don't see a lot of evidence. We're very concerned. A recent poll showed that 51% of American youth between the ages of 18 and 29 do say Vietnam was not a mistake. 51%, this is astounding to us. It was 70% of those over 60, but 51% of the younger kids. That just shows us we're losing the fight in some ways. The fight for memory. For us, it's all about history. It's all about memory. It's all about the past. Vietnam, Oliver fought in Vietnam. I fought against Vietnam. He was highly decorated and wounded twice. I got wounded in a number of battles with police during that time. I was very active in the anti-war movement, so we came to this from different sides, but we met in the middle in terms of our views. But Vietnam is central to both of us. And the fact that Americans are losing their understanding of the history of Vietnam bothers us deeply. When Robert McNamara, I often ask my student, how many Vietnamese died in the war? And I usually get 100,000, maybe 500,000. The ones who really know something say 1 million. Robert McNamara came into my class, who was the brains behind the war, and he said that he believes that 3.8 million Vietnamese died in the war. I asked that question, because how would we feel if the average German youth thought that 500,000 Jews died in the Holocaust? I asked my students, how many Jews died in the Holocaust? Every hand goes up, 6 million. They all know that. They think 500,000 Vietnamese died at the hands of their own government, but 6 million Jews died, they know, at the hands of the Nazis. To me, that's very troubling. It's troubling that Americans learn some of this, occasionally the history of other people's atrocities, but they don't learn the history of their own atrocities. The Vietnam Memorial is very powerful. I'm sure most of you have seen it. And what it lists is the names of 58,252 Americans who died. The message is that the tragedy of Vietnam was that 58,252 Americans died. What we're calling for is a memorial that lists the names of 58,252 Americans, 3.8 million Vietnamese, hundreds of thousands of Cambodians, Laotians, and other people. That's a memorial that says something. Talks about the tragedy, and it's not just a tragedy, it's a crime. The Americans, we talk about the war in Vietnam. We always talk about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, but this is the war in Vietnam. It's sanitized language. It's a battle over language, which Huxley understood, Orwell understood. A lot of it is about language. We don't call it the American invasion of Vietnam. If we called it that, and we talked about the atrocities, we talked about the deaths, then maybe 51% of young people would not think that Vietnam War was justifiable. But this is the way Oliver and I are trying to fight for an uncorrupted view of history, because we think it's so central to how people understand what the United States and the rest of the world is doing now and will do in the future.
One additional comment. I'd just like to say how struck I was in Nagasaki by 2 things. One was the Museum of Atrocities, the Japanese who committed. Private museum, funded privately, and no state support. I've heard that it's a very modest museum, but it's very important because it has maps, pictures, documentation of the Japanese invasion of East Asia, as well as its treatment of prisoners and people. And I'm told that if this museum were in Tokyo, that they would not be able to stay open, that they would be attacked by the right-wing thug organizations that exist in Japan. Well, Peter was involved in the Smithsonian. I have to remind you of the Smithsonian Institute. There was a huge scandal in 1995 to have an exhibit on the Enola Gay. They objected to various things that Peter and his people were trying to put into the exhibit, like the lunchbox, the melted lunchbox that you see at Hiroshima. They wouldn't allow that. They wouldn't allow any. They said it was a disgrace to U.S. veterans. This is the kind of mentality. What we need in the U.S. is a simple museum like in Nagasaki, like the Atomic Museum that I saw there. It explains nuclear weapons, the amounts, the maps, what a nuclear weapon looks like. It shows you the size and the shape of the plutonium bomb that was dropped on Nagasaki. It gives a young person a real look into the power of the bomb, and it's a beautiful. We don't even have a nuclear museum in the U.S. As far as that, Dayton, Ohio, Peter told me, there's a museum in Dayton, Ohio with Boxcar, which is a plane, but there's no knowledge about what nuclear warfare can do. And in reference to American propaganda or television, we live in a world where television would never show this series. The only reason we were on the air was Showtime, because I had a relationship with, and I was able to get it through, took it. They didn't pay for it. We had to finance it. They took it, they played it, they didn't do a lot of advertising. HBO passed, every other cable station passed, and you know, if you're an American, that we would never have gotten this on network television. Never, not in a million years. There's no challenging documentaries. Now you can say 60 Minutes is all this and gets all the Emmy Awards, but I challenge you, would 60 Minutes ever run this kind of story about Hiroshima or Nagasaki or about any aspect of American history? They'll go into an occasional atrocity, but they never give you that big pattern, that big picture view, because they're pro-American. They depend on pro-American sponsorship. Business interests will not pay, corporations will not pay to be critical of America too much. So we have a real roadblock, and our young people are not getting an education unless they go to other alternate means. We have to provide them that.
The museum that Oliver is referring to in Nagasaki is the Oka Masaharu Museum. And we urge all of you to visit it. It's an incredibly eye-opening museum in Nagasaki and is ignored by the city officials. Japan has an institution very alien to the United States known as peace museums. The United States has one peace museum, a little one that's also in Dayton, Ohio, but it's not run by the same people who display Boxcar. But we think that's essential. We need those kinds of museums that critically look at American history. And our big institutions, Oliver mentioned the Enola Gay controversy. Some of you remember that in 1995, and that it was censored. The United States had censorship. The United States was not ready in 1995 to do an honest, balanced exhibit on the atomic bombings. What they did instead was a propaganda exhibit. And then in 2003, at the Air and Space Museum Annex near Dulles Airport in Virginia, they opened up this annex and displayed the Enola Gay. And we fought against that. We didn't fight against displaying it. We said it should be displayed, but it has to be done educationally. What do they do instead? They have no information about the dropping of the atomic bomb. They just give some details about the plane itself. You know, and the plane is not exceptional. What's exceptional is what that plane did. This is 2003. Supposedly we're so concerned about weapons of mass destruction. This is a plane that inaugurated the era of weapons of mass destruction, and the United States can't do an educational exhibit, an honest exhibit about that.
Thank you. Have you found the Japanese media receptive to your message about Japanese war atrocities, or have you been detected any censorship or reluctance to embrace the idea?
Well, we've been getting an enormous amount of coverage, very positive coverage from Japanese media, but we see that the Japanese media is much more comfortable explaining, articulating our critique of Hiroshima and Nagasaki because that fits into Japan's victim narrative. They've been less willing to cover our critique of Japan as a victimizer. So yes, the coverage has been positive, and extensive, but we want to get this other side of the message out also. The headline in the Nikkei Shimbun, which is important, was that Japan must confront its own untold history. That's part of it, because America's untold history and Japan's untold history go hand in hand together. And part of the same process of obfuscating what really happened in the past. So we think that both sides have to come together.
Thank you. Peter? Then, did I see another hand? Peter first, yeah. Yes, please, to the microphone. Did I see any other hands from the working press? Okay.
My name is Peter O'Connor. I'm a historian of propaganda. I'm snuck onto the press table.
Peter, could you speak into the microphone?
Sorry, my name is Peter O'Connor. I'm a historian of propaganda in East Asia. And I've been asking my students over the years at Buster University and Session University to consider the relative status given to the firebombing of Tokyo as opposed to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At Hiroshima it was about 80,000 plus 120,000 and they're still suffering. At Nagasaki it's about 26,000 and another 40,000 since. And that's debatable. It's as debatable as all figures are. In Tokyo, in the 8 months of the final bombing of Tokyo, the firebombing of Tokyo, it was about 500,000 over 8 months, and 10 million refugees left Tokyo. There's a very small monument to the bombing in Tokyo, and it was put up, during the last 5 years. Whereas there's Hiroshima, the mushroom cloud, the lunchbox, whatever, the frozen watch, all of those things have been iconized to a huge extent. Now, I don't see this as a conspiracy anymore. I see most Japanese politics and political history as a conspiracy. I don't see people, the oligarchs getting together in the back room, with a blueprint. I think it's a sort of cock-up kind of history, But I would like to see how you see that.
So how do you see the Tokyo firebombing, the fact that it doesn't get as much attention as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or anything near as much attention?
I see that as, because Tokyo was the second pioneer, Germany was the first pioneer of civilian bombing at Guernica in 1936, and Japan was the second pioneer in Shanghai in 1937. And so Japan was not unique in that, but Japan was unique in being atomic bombed. So I think that's the reason, but I don't know.
First, I guess I would have different numbers than you have for the casualties in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki and in Tokyo, but your point, I think, is an interesting and important one. I've been to the firebombing museum in Tokyo, which people should visit because it deals with some of that history. The United States, before the war started, said we criticized the inhumane barbarism, Roosevelt did, of the firebombing of cities in Spain and in China. We said this was inhumane barbarism and no people should firebomb civilians. By the time the United States got seriously involved in the Pacific War, our policy was based on firebombing. The bombs we dropped were 3/4 incendiaries, designed simply to burn down cities and kill civilians. American attitude was that there was no such thing as a civilian in Japan, and everybody is a fair target. And Curtis LeMay was the mastermind. He was honest about one thing. This was called terror bombing. It was terrorism. It was state-sponsored terrorism. We're so upset about private terrorism, but this was state-sponsored terrorism, and it's a war crime. And Secretary of War Stimson said to Truman in June of 1945, said, I'm so concerned about the firebombing of cities. He said, I don't want the United States to get the reputation for outdoing Hitler in atrocities. And that was the concern, this barbaric killing of Japanese civilians. And then the Hiroshima bombing. The reason why I think the Hiroshima bombing deserves the prominence that it gets is because Truman understood before the bombs were dropped that he was beginning a process that could end all life on the planet. The firebombing of cities was horrible, and it was not going to end all life on the planet. The nuclear age could. Robert Oppenheimer warned the leaders on May 31st, a couple months before the atomic bombs were dropped, that within 3 years, we're likely going to have bombs 7,000 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. By 1954, Edward Teller was proposing a bomb that the U.S. should develop that was 700,000 times as powerful as the Hiroshima bomb. We began a continuum with the firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th and 10th. We expanded it through the firebombing of cities that had no military relevance during the summer of 1945. 99.5% of the city of Toyama was destroyed. But the other interesting thing about it was the Japanese firebombing of Chinese cities was not raised at the Tokyo tribunals. You know why? Because if that was raised, it would have opened up the door to looking at the American firebombing of Japanese cities and to the American atomic bombing, and many people would have understood the barbarity, which is why Oliver and I say, what if Germany had dropped that bomb first? You know, instead of the United States? How the world would look at this as an act of the ultimate barbarity, and hopefully nuclear weapons would have been eliminated. But instead, the United States dropped them, and nuclear weapons were looked upon as something necessary, and in the United States case, something good and defensible. So I think your point is a valid one. There should be much more attention to the Tokyo firebombing and to the other firebombing. But it doesn't have to be counterposed to the atomic bombing. We've got enough room in our memories and our study of history for both.
Absolutely.
Thank
So
you.
neither or.
Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see just gentleman here in the middle, and then Peter down the back.
Obayashi is my name, freelance. You got elected as regarding foreign policy. President Obama's foreign policy for China, especially on the aspect of they want to build a new empire with huge nuclear power. And also they want to conquer the Pacific Rim. China wants to control all the Pacific Rim. This is a question for both speakers.
What was your question? Is that a question?
I
if
think
they
the
do-
question
China
is directed to us is that China, this gentleman is saying China has got evil intentions to build itself up into a nuclear power, I presume on the side, and threaten the entire Pacific Rim. And I'm going to let you handle this, because we've been talking about this with Japanese journalists for days. I'm exhausted.
This is not what the judge said. Well,
But when he's talking about the time that Michael Jackson and Michael Douglas got together, it's not that well known. This is a serious question, though, and it's central to America's global dominance and position. November of 2011, Hillary Clinton wrote an article in Foreign Policy magazine titled "America's Pacific Century." What she said is that the United States needs to shift its focus away from the Middle East, away from Iraq and Afghanistan, and focus on Asia. That the United States has got to become the dominant force in Asia. And how do we do this? By pointing out the threat posed by China. And said that she believed, and Obama supports her, and Gates supports her, that we can frighten the Asian people into aligning more closely with the United States. And what did we do? We started increasing our selling of arms to all the Asian countries, including Japan, massive increase in defense spending in Japan as part of the air-sea battle concept, selling fighter jets to Taiwan, selling them to other countries there, increasing our troop deployment, 2,500 more Marines in Australia. We just now announced that we're going to increase our troop presence in the Philippines. The United States policy is going to be to shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific, Right now, our naval forces are balanced 50% to 50% Atlantic Pacific. We're going to shift that to 62% in the Pacific. Obama has said, well, we've got to cut back on our military spending because of our budget crisis. But he said it's not going to touch our military spending in Asia because this is essential. So how is the United States seeing this? We're seeing this as the new frontier. We're seeing this as the place where we're going to expand militarily. Joint naval operations with countries throughout the region. Militarizing this conflict. Are there real conflicts and issues in Asia? Yes. Is China acting badly? Yes. Is there a strong nationalist element in China? Absolutely. Should China, and China's policy is in some ways stupid, but China has felt weak and humiliated for a long time. And now they feel that they're becoming the #2 economy in the world, that they're modernizing their military, they're trying to assert themselves, they're feeling their way. In some ways they stumble. But China has not been aggressive like the United States. I mean, Japan can ally with the United States, which has fought war after war after war after war after war after war since World War II. Where has China done that? China has not posed that kind of threat. The United States has an empire of perhaps 1,000 bases. How many bases does China have outside China? 1. So China should change its policies, should not give justification to the militarists in Japan, like Abe, in order to increase Japanese military spending, to get rid of Article 9 and the peace constitution, to increase Japanese forces. Some people even want to develop Japanese nuclear weapons. So we see that all, we see China's policies were critical, partly because it's not solving things as peacefully as it should, and because it's giving provocation to the right-wing leaders in Japan and elsewhere, and is scaring countries to support the American global hegemonic vision for Asia. And we see that as the driving force and the dangerous aspect of this policy.
Peter Lyon, Australia's Herald Sun. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate you on your Untold history. It's a great, great project. Thank you very much. Now, given that you briefly mentioned your evaluation of the Bush administration's 4th term, I was just wondering, have you had any response from the Obama administration regarding your project? What have they said about it?
No,
given their fear of the truth.
I would imagine they've ignored it. I don't know that they've even seen it.
Really?
No, honestly, the United States is a big, big country, and you know, I think, as I told this lady, mainstream media has ignored us. Obama has been, for me, you know, as Peter said earlier, I mean, this Bush, those 8 years, those nightmare years, Bush broke the law with the eavesdropping in 2003. He just didn't care about lawyers. He just said, make it up. I don't care what the lawyers do. Just get us, stop these terrorists. And he went to any means necessary. And now with Obama coming in as a constitutional lawyer and a legal scholar, supposedly, he has truly established this method as legal in the minds, and especially of the liberal supporters that supported Obama. He's institutionalized this behavior. It's illegal. We are wiretapping the entire world, essentially, and we can go back and listen to anybody's conversation. We don't have to right now. We can. He's wiretapping the entire world, which is breaking the law. And at the same time, he's saying, well, I have the right to do it because our lawyers say that it's legal, but he won't show us the means by which the lawyers gave him that authority. These are all secrets, the secret method of doing things. This is secret court. This is kangaroo court. He has a FISA is appointed by John Roberts, who's the Chief Justice of the United States, who's a conservative. They appoint mostly prosecutors, they're mostly Republicans, and they've been appointing them for years, and these guys just basically go ahead and grant the government whatever it wants. Now, yeah, you can argue that there are terrorists out there, absolutely, but I don't know that this method locates them. What really has been locating the terrorist threats as they exist is hardcore intelligence and police work around the world. Intelligence agencies cooperating with each other. We didn't need all these laws. We didn't have to go to this extreme. We had to do what the English and the British, what the English, the French, the Italians, the Germans have been doing for many years when they fought terrorism in the late part of the 20th century. Good work, hard work, human intelligence, certain amount of eavesdropping. Yes, it could have been all done. It didn't have to go to this insane degree of overreaction. But Obama, who promised us transparency in government, respect for civil liberties, has violated the 4th and 5th Amendments, which may mean nothing to foreigners, but they mean a hell of a lot to me and the people like me. Because, you know, King John, remember him? Robin Hood, the bad king of England. That was all about the Magna Carta. It was about these guys saying, look, we have no right. The king can decide what he wants. He has complete authority over the law. We have no law on our side. The Magna Carta was about finding the right for every man and woman to have the protection of the law. That's what's been violated here. That's what's so angry, makes me so angry, and many Americans. Snowden is a hero to me. Edward Snowden is a hero because he did this not for profit, not to give give secrets away that could hurt our country, supposedly. I haven't seen one evidence of that. He's doing it out of conscience. A higher law of his conscience is dictated to him. He sacrificed his life for this. He's on the run now, and all the media, the press, reports him as being an outlaw. That's a simplistic reaction. The truth is, he sacrificed his well-being for the good of us all. We should all be concerned about this. We should all turn on our government. The press is at stake too, as we know. The whistleblowers have been threatened by the law. There's been 7 cases, I believe, 7 cases of whistleblowing prosecutions. It's a very, very ugly time. This is what Orwell was prescient. But this is Big Brother in a way that Orwell could never foresee. They can see into every home. Obama says, well, don't worry about it. We're not listening in. Yeah, but you could listen in. And we know that somebody in the future, if it's not you, it could be Mr. Bush III who comes along, Miss Hillary Clinton, whatever. Terrorism, it's nonsense. This terrorist band has ruined the world. I mean, the United States has lost its mind. Brzezinski, who we condemn for his policy in Afghanistan, Brzezinski is attacked as being over-ridiculous. The truth is that we have to go back. I don't know how we can go back, but we have to get off this terrorism thing. The problem is that we go around the world, every public protest, every demonstration against the government, whether it's civil rights, Vietnam War, students against Iraq, these are very important protests. They grow out of the Arab Spring. That's where it comes out of the people. But what is being targeted here is not just terrorists, but those groups. In other words, anybody who protests government policies in the future, whether it's Wall Street bankers, if you protest against them, you're going to be targeted as a potential threat. The Boston Marathon, they were so busy tracking down protesters against green organizations and against various other things that they missed the bombers. It's never about terrorists. It always becomes about the way J. Edgar Hoover did it. He brought all the weight of government to bear on protesters. He didn't like protesters. He thought they were left-wing communists. He never could find the proof, but by the time the Vietnam War came around, as you know, 500,000 people were on the list, and they were being eavesdropped on. Where are we now? Same place. Obama is a snake. He's a snake. And we have to turn on him. I know he likes snakes, but...
First here, and then Hasagawa-san, and then I see a hand up at the back, and then this right.
Dr. Gleisen, German Press Agency, DPA. One quick question on Japan. Have you ever thought about doing a similar project on the untold history of Japan? Or if you haven't, have you, or could you think about teaming up with a Japanese director or Japanese historians who would be willing, if there's any, who would be willing to incorporate such a project?
Well, I would do it if I could, as a producer, I could not devote the same amount of time and loss of money to making such a project in Japan. It would have to be financed by and made by Japanese. And we would certainly cooperate if all fun and it was working, it was workable.
Peter, did you want to say anything?
I'm all in. If Oliver's in, I'm in. We'd love to see it. And the longer we're in Japan, every day we're here, we see more of a demand for this on the part of our Japanese friends and colleagues and media. And the more we learn, and the more Oliver and I, this is a learning experience for both of us. We're learning from the hibakusha, we're learning from the journalists, we're learning from the historians, we're reading constantly. Because neither of us is really, I'm an expert in certain aspects of Japanese history, but not the broad view. And Oliver's not an expert in Japanese history. But the more we see, the more we learn, the more troubling it is for us. And the more we realize how important Japan's coming to grips with its past is for Japan, but also for the United States and for the rest of the world. Japan and the United States are linked together in this web of deceit, in which we both collaborate to tell lies about all of our history. And Japan and the United States as the first and the third biggest economies in the world, the first and the fourth biggest militaries in the world. If our countries were doing something good for the world, rather than what we have been doing, I think we would make an enormous difference. And we would like to see Japan reaching out more to China in a positive way, dealing with the horrible things that the Japanese did to the Chinese in a way that will start to build some trust and get past the crazy nationalism that we see in both countries.
My name is Hasegawa from Radio Nikkei. You have found much on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but how did you pay attention to Fukushima nuclear disaster?
I actually co-wrote a book that deals with the history of Japanese nuclear power. And my perspective on this is really from Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. As part, Eisenhower wanted the United States to do away with its army in large part and depend on nuclear weapons. When Eisenhower became president in '53, the United States had 1,000 nuclear weapons. When Eisenhower left office, the United States had 30,000 nuclear weapons. 23,000. When Eisenhower's budgeting cycle was finished, the United States had 30,000 nuclear weapons. Eisenhower went from nuclear weapons as a last resort to nuclear weapons as a first resort. From one finger on the nuclear button to dozens of fingers on the nuclear button. America's war plan called for 650 million deaths if the United States went to war against the Soviet Union under Eisenhower. But how did Eisenhower sell this to the world? He said, we can't get the world to accept using nuclear weapons unless we can convince them that nuclear power is also a good thing. So he goes before the United Nations, December 1953, and calls for atoms for peace. It was a lie. It was a deception. It was a fraud. You look at the documents, they say explicitly, we have to do this in order to make nuclear weapons usable. And that was the strategy. And so we decided we were going to push nuclear energy development in Japan, in collaboration with Japanese leaders, one of whom was Shoriki, who was a Class A war criminal, who was let off by the United States and founds the Yomiuri Shimbun, and he works with the United States and the CIA and the USIA, and we begin to propagandize Japan. It was not easy, especially because Japan was the victim, and then after the Lucky Dragon 5 incident in 1954, the Japanese public was outraged about nuclear weapons. In the next year, literally 1/3 of the entire Japanese population signs petitions against nuclear weapons. So how is the United States going to overcome this? With a concerted propaganda effort. And where did they want to build the first nuclear reactor? In Hiroshima. That's what the United States would hope to do. So the United States pushes Japan to develop nuclear power, and from there, the craziness of a country like Japan that's so earthquake prone to develop nuclear reactors makes no sense to us at all. Japan should have a very different policy. China is leading the world in terms of solar power. Japan, with its great technological brilliance, should be right there with China. Unfortunately, Japan is instead getting its energy from liquefied natural gas largely from the United States, which comes from fracking, which is a very dangerous process. So there's not necessarily easy answers, but Fukushima was an accident, a disaster waiting to happen, and then what happens there is what happens in every nuclear disaster, and they lie about it. TEPCO covers up what's really happening, and now we see the horrible environmental consequences. Not only the cesium and the other waste being released through the air, but the pouring of massive amounts of radioactive waste into the ocean. There doesn't seem to be a solution that anybody at TEPCO or the Japanese government is coming up with. Maybe Lucy and David have a better understanding of this, but this is a very dangerous situation, and we don't. Abe wants to reopen the rest of the nuclear plants. Right now, only 2 of the 50 plants have been reopened. We think that's a very, very bad idea. We think that Rokasho is a very bad idea, and that Japan should find a way, a different way, to get energy and to have a peaceful kind of development.
Thank you. Okay, I think the gentleman at the back has been waiting for a while, and then this gentleman here. We're running out of time. We've got 5 minutes. I think we're going to extend for. Okay, so 15 more minutes. All right. So the question is.
Hi, thank you for your time. It is directed to Director Stone. What do you want people to do with this knowledge? Because do you want like more Snowdens? Do you want revolts? Do you want people to vote out the current administration? Because at the heart of it, at the core of it, government spin. I mean, spin is just part of the whole process. Yeah? I mean, power has always been
name of the
in
company.
their vested interest. So, and so, what do you want people to exactly do with this newfound, like, oh, yeah, the government did screw us kind of knowledge? And another thing, do you find that you're fighting a very isolated battle? Because to a certain extent, truth costs money. I mean, you are not beholden to anyone. You can fund this project, but I mean, do you find that you're fighting an isolated battle to get the truth out? Could you wait for a couple of seconds for the vote?
Charles is working for TV.
Yes, I feel very isolated, but every time I go out in public, as I've appeared in many countries and many schools in America too, colleges and high schools, I feel I'm not alone. We're not alone. We made this movie and we've been rewarded in so many ways. Perhaps we'll even make a little profit by the end of the day. With the DVD sales, who knows? It was well worth it. It was perhaps the best film experience I've ever had. In the last 5 years, I've learned more history than I've learned in my previous life. It reinforces my belief that I am doing the right thing with my life. I feel good karma, as they say, as a result of this. It's as if we are warriors for peace. I've been a warrior my whole life, but now I feel more than ever that I'm a warrior for peace. As to your other question, everyone has to take their own. This is a 12-hour, it covers 70 years. Everyone must take away from it what they can take away. Somebody might be more interested in nuclear power, some people might be interested in Snowden. What you see is a massive abuse of trust in the world. The United States, as I said early when I started, dropped this bomb and innocently told the world that this was the right thing to do. It was not the right thing to do. It was not the right thing to do. It was the wrong thing to do. We are very adamant about that, and that's why it's so important to stress that point. But the bomb is not the story of the bomb. This is a story of what happens as a result of that pattern. The pattern goes on and on. You see Eisenhower militarizing the United States with bombs and giving nuclear authority to commanders and sub-commanders, which sets up the Dr. Strangelove scenario, where John Kennedy all of a sudden in 1962 has to confront the results of John Foster Dulles and Dwight Eisenhower's policy of nuclear brinksmanship come home, nuclear brinksmanship. So there's a great lesson in John Kennedy's behavior of courage. We go into detail with John Kennedy. We talked about it yesterday at the Hayakawa conference. That was a beautiful section they showed, chapter 6. Kennedy was a great warrior for peace. We go into the Gorbachev section with great love, and we try to show the hope of the world. Gorbachev really was a man who was a colossus of his time. I don't care what they say about him in Russia. We're looking at the big picture. the big picture. And, you know, when we come down to today, we call it the age of terror. We had to finish this thing in January of this year, and we have Bush and Obama as together in one chapter. It's a lot of, that's 13 years, quite a lot of events, so we had to make our choices. We went with that last chapter 10. It sums up Peter and my feelings about what's going on in the world today. We call at the end of this series for magnanimity. We call for generosity of spirit. We talk about soft power. We talk about leaders like Roosevelt, like Wallace, like Kennedy. They not just talk in terms of hard power. They talk with empathy about the suffering of people around the world. To look at other countries with compassionate eyes, like Henry Wallace did towards the Soviet Union, after they'd been devastated by World War II, devastated. You can look at the Soviets and you can see Stalin and tyranny and all this, but you can also look at the Soviets another way. So it's very much important to take, I think, to walk away from the series with a sense of widening compassion, more consciousness about the struggles of other people for their independence. We go into some depth on the Third World, Bandung Conference of 1955, how important that was in the middle of the madness that Nasser and Nehru and Sukarno and Tito and came together. The sane people of the world to say enough of this race to madness. Think about us. We want to have our countries develop without this Cold War politics. And of course, the United States, and not the Soviet Union, the United States takes the lead in taking down most of those leaders. We have a lot to bear on that. We have a very dirty history with the CIA, very dirty. As effective as the KGB was, the CIA was far more effective, although we always pretended to be the underdogs. Don't forget that when Kennedy ran for office, and always through American history, we are always under threat. The Soviets have more weaponry. There's always a missile gap. The Chinese, as this gentleman was talking about the Chinese like a nuclear monster, but they're not even close to us. With their nuclear capability, nothing compared to ours. We, the United States of developed, in chapter 10, we talk about space weaponry that's unbelievably sophisticated. Professor McCoy from Wisconsin talks about drones in space that can be fired by maybe in the next 10 years from 250 miles up that can be so precise to hit an individual target from space. We can talk about scenarios like blowing up countries from space.
So do you want to see more protests?
We talk
against
about
governments?
cyber warfare. I'm sorry. We talk about cyber warfare. The United States pictures China as this big cyber attacks, and then ironically, of course, we find out that we're the ones. We know that we're the ones who cyber attacked Iran first. But we talk about China as violating everything. Well, this is a mentality that the United States has developed of being the underdog. As a result, perhaps it's a good mentality if you're thinking only about the United States. As a result, we've kind of snuck in. Now we're supposed to be this quiet empire. We're not quiet. We're very loud. The world has figured this out. And Snowden has figured it out. And the fact that every country, except for 3 or 4 countries, 5 countries, have given him any kind of home, tells you how sick the world has become, how uniform. Where was France when Snowden? When France under de Gaulle would have given him asylum. I believe Germany should have given him asylum. I was most upset when Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, who was followed in the footsteps of Lula in Brazil, Dilma said no right away. Right away. Brazil really let us down. The fact that the whole world is so scared of the United States, so scared. I'm glad China did not arrest him. At least China had the guts to stand up that way, but they did kind of get him out of there. The Soviet Union, I think Mr. Putin did the right thing, and I'm proud of him for doing that. And we need more countries to stand up to the U.S. The U.S. has to hear no, has to hear defiance. That's what Chavez was good for. He was he kept regional power. Regional power is a solution. Turkey, Brazil, Venezuela, China, Russia, all these countries. Japan, for Christ's sake. You guys have been asleep. These prime ministers have been asleep for 68 years now. You know, we need the Japan, I'm going to go further, disassociate itself from the United States, the status of force agreements. They've got to get away from the United States nuclear umbrella because they can be a great country again and a real broker for peace in Asia. And by the way, Japan's interest in the long run could very much lie with China. You already are the first trading partner with China. Don't look at China as your enemy. Start seeing it differently. Start by apologizing. Start by apologizing to China for what you did in China and all the people you killed there. Start apologizing for that. And that would go a long way to, all of a sudden the world would say, what? Japan apologized? That would be a shock to the world. They'd make front page headlines everywhere in the world. And it would be a beginning of like what Gorbachev did with the Soviet Union. Hey, we don't want to compete with you. We want peaceful coexistence. What if Japan did that tomorrow? Wow. It would be like a spring, a thaw, a new world beginning. And then China would suddenly look at Japan a little differently, instead of hating Japan. That would be the beginning. Thaws. What's your question now?
No problem. So are you saying that you support the militarization of Japan? Because if Japan doesn't need the US, it has to militarize.
No, it doesn't. You're giving a false set of choices, a false set of alternatives. Japan has already militarized. Japan is already the fourth biggest defense spender in the world. What Japan needs is a defensive force. It does not need an aggressive force. There's a lot of pressure now to do away with Article 9, either through Article 96 or other ways to do away with Article 9. What we want to see is Article 9 mean something again. It already hasn't meant very much. But what we're concerned about, if Japan does away with Article 9, it's going to get much more directly involved in America's wars, and Japanese boys are going to be coming home in body bags, the same way that American men and women have been coming home in body bags since World War II, from war after war after war. Is that the future that Japan wants? To be even more intimately involved in America's wars? I don't think so. But there's a couple other points I wanted to just add. In the question he asked, he said, truth costs money. Well, the reality is that untruth costs lives. And that's the choice we have. Yes, truth might cost money, but untruth, the cost that we pay for untruths is a lot more than the cost that we pay for truth. T.S. Eliot asked a very poignant question in his work Gerontion, and he asked, after such knowledge, what forgiveness? Oliver and I are trying to get that knowledge out there. We see ourselves as involved in a struggle, a monumental struggle, and we need everybody's support in this. And it's a struggle between our enemies have got all the guns, they've got all the weapons, they've got all the bombs, they've got all the bombers, they control the media, they control much of the education. What we've got is the truth. And it's a battle between truth on the one hand and the forces of oppression and militarization and exploitation on the other. We think the truth is very powerful. And we look around the world, and of course we support protests along these lines, but it's more than that. The world, there's a seething unrest all over the world right now. We see it in Greece, where 60% of young people between the ages of 18 and 20 and 30 are unemployed. We saw this in Tunisia. A 26-year-old street vendor was humiliated one time too many, and he burned himself to death. And it sparked an explosion. In Tunisia began the Arab Spring. We saw it in Egypt. We saw it in Turkey. We saw it in Brazil. We're seeing this everywhere. In the United States, we see signs of that. We see that as hopeful. We're trying to give it some sense of history. We see this as the weapon, the history that the Occupy movement and these other movements around the world need to begin to think. And that's why our focus is on history. One of the problems in the United States is that people don't think in utopian terms anymore. They believe that the present is this way and is inevitable. What we're saying is no, there's nothing inevitable about the world that we've created. That if we were going to start all over as sane human beings, this is not the world we would create. We wouldn't create a world in which the richest 300 people have more wealth than the poorest 3 billion. We wouldn't create a world armed to the teeth, the cyber, I mean, everywhere. The weapons, the space, the military weaponization of space, the surveillance. This is not the world we would create. And we have to show people that it could have been different, that there are ways to think about it differently, and we still have time The world still is here. We still have the ability to make this into a different world. And we hope that our untold history triggers other untold histories, and people around the world see this as a weapon of truth to use against power.
Thank you. With apologies to the people who have their hands up, I'm afraid I'm under strict orders to end. I'm under strict orders to end at 2:10. I'm sorry. Unless you guys can, if you want to say, you can take another question. That's fine. But I've been told to end at 2:10. One more. I'm afraid it's this gentleman here. Yeah. So make it a very quick one if you don't mind.
Michael Galbraith, a freelancer. I'd like to change the subject a little bit. I'd like to ask you whether your untold history offers a new view of how Japan became involved in World War II at the very beginning, and or a new view on the role played by the huge amounts of gold recovered by the American government at the end of World War II. Doesn't some of that gold underwrite the patterns you were talking about? Thank you.
Oh, that sounds like a very complicated answer. Can you direct them to page 65 in the book or something? See how much this gold is.
The answer very simply to that question is no. It's an untold history of the United States, the American empire, and the national security state. We wrote our U.S. book is 800 pages. We got to 800 pages after we cut out almost 200 more. We wanted a book that people could lift. And so we had to keep it on a manageable size. Initially, our publisher wanted 275 pages. We fought with them to get up to 800. There are so many stories that we didn't have time to tell. So much history we didn't have time to explore. But we're trying to get at the essential points that we think are central to understanding the American empire, the national security state, the global security state, what's happening now, why the world has gone the direction it has, and what can be done to change it. And that's about as much as we were able to do.
Thank you. Well, thanks to Peter and Oliver for what I thought was a fascinating speech. I'm looking forward to the headline in the Yomiuri tomorrow. Japan and the US linked together in a web of deceit, and then a little box on Shoriki. That would be a hell of a front page on the Yomiuri.
Thank you very much for having us.